Barista mocked Leonardo DiCaprio at a coffee shop, but the shocking twist will leave you speechless. The coffee shop was packed, the smell of espresso thick in the air, the steady hum of conversation blending with the hiss of steaming milk. It was just another ordinary morning, until it wasn't. No one noticed at first, just a barista behind the counter cracking a joke to his co-worker, laughing under his breath. A small smirk, a glance at a customer waiting in line, the kind of moment most people wouldn't think twice about. But if you were really paying attention, if you caught the way his voice shifted, the way his words landed just a little too hard, you'd realize this wasn't just a joke. And the man he was laughing at, he wasn't just any customer, he was Leonardo DiCaprio. But that's not even the shocking part. Because what happened next, what Leo did, how the cafe reacted, how this story ended, left everyone speechless. And when the truth came out, no one could believe it. It was an ordinary morning at one of Los Angeles's most popular high-end coffee shops, the kind of place where influencers snapped photos of their lattes before taking a sip, where aspiring screenwriters hunched over laptops trying to craft the next big Hollywood script. The air smelled of freshly ground espresso, and the hum of conversation blended with the occasional hiss of steaming milk. Behind the counter, a young barista named Trevor was moving at his usual speed, half-heartedly making drinks, half-heartedly cracking jokes with his co-worker Jake. Trevor had been working at the shop for a little over a year, and if there was one thing he was known for, it was pushing the limits of what could be considered just a joke. He wasn't outright cruel, not in a way that would get him fired, but he had a way of making comments that left a strange aftertaste, the kind people either laughed off or ignored to avoid confrontation. It was when the door swung open that Trevor's morning took an unexpected turn. A man walked in wearing a plain grey hoodie, baseball cap pulled low over his face, sunglasses covering his eyes. He was trying not to attract attention, but Trevor had an eye for spotting celebrities, and there was no mistaking that face. It was Leonardo DiCaprio. Trevor nudged Jake, whispering, "Yo, that's him." Jake glanced up briefly, then back down at the drinks he was making. "Who?" "DiCaprio," Trevor muttered, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Hollywood's golden boy. Mr. Save the Planet." Jake sighed. "Dude, just make the drink." Trevor wasn't listening. His mind was already churning, thinking of something clever to say. The thing about working in a coffee shop in LA was that celebrities came in all the time. Most baristas just nodded, smiled, and let them be. But Trevor, he saw an opportunity, a chance to get a reaction, a story, maybe even a viral moment. Leo stepped up to the counter, keeping things simple. "Hey, can I just get a soy latte?" His voice was quiet, polite, as if he was used to keeping his presence low-key. Trevor smiled, too wide, too eager. "Sure thing, boss. Name?" Leo hesitated for a second. Just Leo." Trevor clicked his tongue. "Leo, huh? You sure you don't want to put Eco-Warrior on the cup instead?" Jake shot Trevor a warning glance. A couple of customers looked up. Leo just smiled slightly, shaking his head. "Just Leo's fine." Trevor wrote the name down with an exaggerated flourish, still grinning as he moved to make the drink. But he wasn't done yet, not even close. As he steamed the milk, he leaned in toward Jake again, voice low but loud enough for a few nearby customers to hear. "Bet he wants it oat milk, you know. Save the cows, save the trees, save the whole damn planet." He snickered. "All while flying in a private jet." Jake's jaw tightened. "Dude, cut it out." Trevor just smirked, unfazed. He turned to another co-worker at the register, nudging them. "Hey, you ever notice how these guys always pretend to care, like real passionate about saving the world until they're back in their mansions?" The words hung in the air for a moment, sharp and cutting. Some customers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke up. That was the thing about these moments. People felt the discomfort, but very few were willing to step into it. Leo, meanwhile, was still waiting patiently, standing at the pickup counter, seemingly unfazed. If he'd heard, he didn't show it. Trevor decided to push further. He turned back toward the drink station, calling out in a voice that was just a little too loud, just a little too performative. "One soy latte for white savior." A few heads snapped up. A woman at a nearby table set down her phone, her brows furrowing. Even Jake's hands stilled mid-motion. Trevor could feel the shift, the way the atmosphere in the shop had suddenly changed. But instead of backing off, he doubled down. He grabbed the cup, held it up for emphasis, and called it again, laughing. "White savior, your latte's ready." This time, there was no mistaking the reaction. The cafe had gone dead silent. Leo stepped forward, still calm, still composed. He reached for the cup, but just as his fingers brushed it, Trevor pulled it back slightly, smirking. "You good, man?" Leo's hand stilled. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, something small but undeniable. A moment passed, then another, and then Leo spoke. "You think you're funny?" His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even raised. It was quiet, controlled, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. Trevor shrugged. "Just messing around, dude. Relax, no harm, no foul." Leo nodded slowly, as if considering something. Then he took off his sunglasses, lifted his cap just slightly, so his face was fully visible. For the first time, Trevor seemed to hesitate. "You know," Leo said, voice steady, "it's funny how people like you always hide behind just joking when they know they've crossed a line." Trevor scoffed. "Oh, come on, man. I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking." Leo tilted his head slightly, studying him. "Really? Everyone?" Trevor motioned vaguely toward the customers. "I mean, yeah. Let's be real, dude. The whole Hollywood woke thing, it's a joke. You make movies about them and suddenly you're a hero." Leo's expression didn't change, but his next words hit like a hammer. "Them?" he repeated softly. "Who are you talking about?" Trevor opened his mouth, but no words came out. It was in that moment that the weight of what he'd said, not just the words, but the implication, seemed to finally sink in. And the people around him? They weren't laughing. They weren't nodding in agreement. They were watching, silently and waiting. For the first time that morning, Trevor had nothing to say. Leo didn't move. His gaze was steady, unblinking. The tension in the cafe was thick now, like a storm cloud hanging overhead, waiting to break. Trevor shifted on his feet, the smirk on his face faltering for the first time. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but his instinct was to fight against it, to regain control. "Look, man," Trevor said, forcing a laugh, though it came out hollow. "You're taking this way too seriously. It's a joke. Relax." Leo let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way Trevor expected. There was no outburst, no grand display of emotion. But there was something in his expression that made Trevor more uncomfortable than if he had been yelling. It was disappointment. "You think I don't know guys like you?" Leo finally said, his voice low, almost conversational. "I've met 100 of you, 1,000. People who think they can say whatever they want, brush it off as a joke, and when someone calls them on it, they act like the other person is overreacting, like they're the problem." Trevor folded his arms, trying to act unaffected. "Dude, it's coffee. Chill." Leo gave a short, humorless chuckle. "Is it?" He tilted his head. "Because I think it's something else. I think you saw me walk in here, And you thought you knew who I was. You thought you could get a laugh at my expense, maybe even impress some people, but now you're realizing that nobody's laughing. Trevor glanced around the cafe. The other customers had gone from passive observers to something more. A few were watching with open disapproval. Others were waiting to see what Leo would do next. Even Jake had stopped pretending to work and was looking at Trevor with an expression that was somewhere between frustration and disappointment. Trevor could feel his control slipping. He didn't like it. He wasn't used to it. "All right, man," he said, putting his hands up. "You got your moment. You gonna cancel me now? Post this online? Ruin my life because I made a dumb joke?" Leo's expression didn't change. He took a step closer, just enough that Trevor had no choice but to really look at him. "You want to talk about ruining lives?" Leo's voice was still quiet, but it had sharpened like a blade sliding from its sheath. "Let me tell you something. I grew up in a neighborhood where people like you ran their mouths like this all the time, where jokes like yours turned into something real, something dangerous. You think what you said was harmless? Try being a kid hearing that every day. Try watching your best friend get called them like he's not a person, like he's an issue, a burden, like he's something to be talked about, not someone to be seen." Trevor blinked. He hadn't expected that. Leo exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "You want to know what I learned growing up?" He looked Trevor dead in the eyes. "Racism doesn't always come in loud, obvious ways. It doesn't always look like hate crimes or slurs. Sometimes it looks like this, like jokes that don't land, like words that cut deeper than you realize, like people who pretend they don't see it happening because it's easier than speaking up." Trevor felt heat rising to his face. He wanted to argue, to push back, but something in Leo's tone kept him silent. "You want to know what really gets me," Leo continued. "You don't even believe what you're saying. Not really. You just want attention. You want to be the guy who tells it like it is because you think it makes you look cool. But all it really does is show everyone exactly who you are." Trevor clenched his jaw. He had been embarrassed before, but never like this. He glanced at Jake, hoping for backup, but Jake just shook his head, muttering, "Man, you did this to yourself." Leo nodded slightly, as if he had been expecting that reaction. He turned back to Trevor. "You asked me if I was going to cancel you. Number, I'm not. Because this isn't about you getting cancelled. This is about whether you want to be the kind of person who hides behind sarcasm, or the kind of person who actually listens when someone tells you you've messed up." Trevor swallowed hard. His throat was dry. He didn't know how to respond. And then something unexpected happened. A voice, soft but strong, cut through the heavy silence. "He's right." Trevor turned, startled, and saw a woman standing near the back of the cafe. She looked to be in her 50s, dressed simply, but there was something powerful in the way she held herself. She stepped forward, her eyes locked onto Trevor. "You know how I know," she said, "because I grew up in the same neighborhood as him, and I saw the same things." Trevor frowned, confused. "Wait, what?" The woman looked at Leo, a small, knowing smile on her face. "You probably don't remember me, but I remember you. My son used to run around with you when you were kids. You stood up for him more times than I can count." Leo's face softened in recognition. "Ms. Turner." She nodded. "That's right. And you know what? I remember the kids who said things like that too. And I remember what kind of people they turned into." She looked back at Trevor. "Do you?" Trevor's face burned. "You have a choice, young man," Ms. Turner said. "You can keep pretending this is all a joke, or you can open your eyes and realize what it really is." Trevor's hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to argue. He wanted to defend himself. But he couldn't. Not when the weight of everything, Leo's words, the woman's presence, the quiet waiting stares of the people around him, was pressing down on him like a tidal wave. And for the first time in his life, Trevor didn't have a comeback. He just stood there, feeling something unfamiliar stir inside him. Regret, shame, and maybe, just maybe, the smallest spark of understanding. Trevor felt his whole body tighten. The cafe felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in on him. He could still hear the hum of the espresso machine, the occasional scrape of a chair against the floor, but everything else had faded away. All he could focus on was the weight of their stares. Leo's, Ms. Turner's, Jake's, the other customers. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled with words. It just sat there, heavy, demanding. He wanted to brush it off, to roll his eyes and mutter something sarcastic, anything to break the moment. But he couldn't, because deep down he knew they were right. He had always known. He wasn't some villain. He didn't walk around spouting hate. He didn't think of himself as racist. But wasn't that the whole point? The worst people weren't the ones who were outright cruel. The worst people were the ones like him, the ones who thought it was all just funny, the ones who made the jokes, who nudged their friends, who never stopped to think about what those words actually meant. And now, standing here, he realized something else. He had finally gone too far, and everyone had seen it. A cough broke the silence. It was his manager, stepping out from behind the back counter, arms crossed, face unreadable. "Trevor," she said, voice firm. He swallowed. "Yeah?" "Take off your apron." It wasn't a request. Trevor felt the words hit him like a slap. Wait, hold on. Now." His hands shook as he untied the knot at his back, slipping the apron over his head. His heart was hammering in his chest. He wanted to argue, to say it wasn't fair, that it was just a misunderstanding, that he was being cancelled for no reason. But the look on his manager's face told him there was no point. "You're done here," she said. "I can't have this kind of behavior in my shop." Trevor looked around, hoping for someone, anyone, to back him up. But no one did. Even Jake, his co-worker, just shook his head. "Man, you should have just let it go." Trevor opened his mouth, closed it again. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, each step heavier than the last. Outside, the sun was too bright, the air too warm. He stepped onto the sidewalk, his hands clenched into fists. He had been humiliated. He had lost his job. And for what? A joke. Number, not just a joke. His own words echoed back at him, twisting in ways he didn't like. Sometimes racism looks like this, like jokes that don't land, like words that cut deeper than you realize. He sat down on the curb, rubbing his hands over his face. Was this it for him? Was this who he was going to be? A shadow passed over him. He looked up. Ms. Turner stood in front of him, arms crossed. She studied him for a moment before finally speaking. "You think this is the worst thing that's ever going to happen to you?" Trevor didn't answer. "Trust me," she said. "It's not." She glanced back toward the cafe, where Leo was still inside, speaking with the manager. "That man in there? He could have done a lot worse to you. He could have let this blow up into a viral nightmare. He could have let your whole world burn for what you said. But he didn't. He gave you a chance to hear yourself, a chance to do something with this moment instead of throwing it away." Trevor looked down at his hands. "I don't know what you want me to say." Ms. Turner sighed. "I don't want you to say anything." She pointed to her temple. "I want you to think. I want you to sit with this and ask yourself why you said what you did. Why you felt the need to mock someone who didn't even do anything to you. And when you figure that out, I want you to ask yourself if you like the answer." Trevor didn't respond. Ms. Turner watched him a second longer, then turned and walked away, disappearing back into the cafe. For the first time in a long time, Trevor didn't have a comeback. A week passed, then two. By the third, the video had gone viral. Someone in the cafe had recorded the whole thing. Trevor's words, Leo's response, the firing, all of it. And the internet did what it always did. His name was everywhere. The comment sections were brutal. Some people called him exactly what he feared: a racist, a bigot, a lost cause. Others said he was just another dumb kid who had made a mistake. But the one thing no one did, no one defended him, and that was what hurt the most. He had spent so much time thinking he was in on the joke, only to realize that he had always been the punchline. Then, the unexpected happened. One morning, scrolling through his phone, he saw a headline that made his stomach drop. Leonardo DiCaprio's viral coffee shop moment, you won't believe his response. Trevor hesitated, then clicked. The video opened on Leo, sitting in a quiet room, looking directly into the camera. "This whole thing has gotten a lot of attention," Leo said. "And a lot of people have asked me how I feel about it. The truth is, I don't want to see another person torn apart online. That's not how we fix this. That's not how we move forward." Trevor's breath caught. "I've made mistakes," Leo continued. "Plenty of them. The only difference is mine weren't caught on camera. That doesn't make me better, it just makes me luckier. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that people don't change because they're punished. They change because they choose to." Trevor's stomach twisted. Leo leaned forward. "Trevor, if you're watching this, I hope you choose to." Trevor closed his phone, exhaling shakily. That was it. No rant, no demand for him to be erased from the internet, just a challenge. He sat with it for a long time, and then, for the first time in his life, he decided to listen. Trevor wasn't sure what he expected to feel when he closed the video. Maybe relief, maybe anger, maybe nothing at all. But what he actually felt was something new, something heavier, something uncomfortable. Leo's words echoed in his head. People don't change because they're punished. They change because they choose to. For days, that sentence gnawed at him. He wanted to brush it off, to move on, to pretend none of this had happened. But he couldn't, because every time he looked in the mirror, he saw someone he wasn't sure he liked. And that realization scared him. At first, he thought about disappearing, deleting his social media, avoiding the internet, pretending like this was just a bad moment in his past, something people would forget about eventually. But deep down, he knew that wasn't enough. He didn't want to just be forgotten. He wanted to be better. So, for the first time in his life, Trevor did something he had never done before. He listened. He started reading. Not just news articles, but real stories. Stories from people who had lived through things he had never even thought about. He watched videos, interviews, conversations where people talked about the exact kind of jokes he used to make and how those words followed them for years. And the more he learned, the more ashamed he felt. But that shame wasn't useless. It wasn't empty. It was fuel. One day, he sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and started typing. His hands shook as he did it, but he didn't stop. When he was done, he took a deep breath and hit post. The video went up on his old account, the one people had been flooding with hate ever since the cafe incident. But this time, instead of ignoring it, instead of running, he looked straight into the camera. "I was wrong. No intro, no excuses, just the truth. I've spent the last month thinking about what happened, about what I said, about the way I brushed it off like it was no big deal. And I realize now, it was a big deal. Not just because I got caught, not just because it went viral, but because words matter. And the ones I used, they hurt people." His throat tightened. He swallowed hard but didn't stop. "For a long time, I thought racism was just loud, obvious. bad guys saying bad things. I never stopped to think about how it works in the little moments, the jokes, the things we say without even thinking. But I see it now, and I see how I was part of the problem. He exhaled, looking down for a second before meeting the camera again. I don't want to be that guy anymore, and I know an apology isn't enough. So instead of just saying sorry and moving on, I'm actually doing the work. I'm learning, I'm listening, and I want to keep listening. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. So, if you've ever been on the receiving end of a joke like mine, if you've ever had someone talk down to you, dismiss you, make you feel small because of who you are, I want to hear your story. Comment below. Teach me what I should have already known. I won't argue. I won't defend myself. I'll just listen. He pressed his lips together, nodding once. And if you're someone like me, someone who's made these jokes, who's laughed them off, who's never really thought about what they mean, maybe it's time to listen too. The video ended. And this time, when the comments started pouring in, Trevor didn't ignore them. He read every single one. Some people didn't forgive him. And that was okay. He had earned that. But some people did. Some people told him their stories, raw and honest. And for the first time, instead of rolling his eyes or brushing it off, he actually heard them. And as he sat there, watching the conversations unfold, something strange happened. Hope. Because people can change, not because they're forced to, not because they're scared of being cancelled, but because one day they wake up and decide that being better is more important than being comfortable. So now it's your turn. If you've ever been in a situation like this, if you've ever been mocked, dismissed, or made to feel like less because of a joke, tell your story in the comments. Let people hear what it's really like. And if you're someone who's made jokes like this before, if you've ever laughed along, if you've ever thought, come on, it's not that serious, I have one question for you. Are you ready to listen?